I'm going to call the meeting of Joint Administrative Procedures Committee to order, and I'm going to ask Ms. LoShallow to call the roll, please.
Senator Cruz?
Here.
Senator Hooper?
Here.
Senator Perry?
Next, we will hear for our final speaker is David Daniel, Vice President, Smith, Bryan, and Myers in Tallahassee. I'd like to welcome Mr. Daniel. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is David Daniel. I represent Florida Association for Child Care Management. We are an association of private child care providers in the state of Florida. Ultimately, our goal is working to create a more efficient and effective early learning programs that better serve Florida's families and our children. Many of you know I have a big family, and the polar vortex coming in. My daughter came down one day, and it was all cold outside, and she's dressed in a short sleeve shirt and some shorts. And I said, "Hey, honey, it's gonna be cold outside today. You need to go put on a sweater." And so she went back upstairs and came down with a little sweater and the same piece, So I thought, dress warmer. That's not really what I was talking about. But she had actually obeyed me, and she had done what I had said I had to do. And I think that story, the point that I want to make with that story is sometimes things that I say to my kids, I'm not quite clear, and they do what I say, but it's not quite what I wanted. And I think that to the point in granted legislative rulemaking authority, and the rulemaking process is really no different. When you direct an agency and what you give the direction to the agency isn't clear on the front end, you're not going to get what you want on the back end. In July of 2018, a correspondent named Ryan McKinnon wrote an article in the Sarasota Herald Tribune. It was entitled, "The Confounding State of Child Care in Florida." And reading from the article, it says, "The high cost of child care in Florida is well documented. A year could easily top $8,000 or more than the base tuition at the University of Florida. Providers are just scraping by while parents are breaking the bank to pay for child care. Child care is an important component to our working families, and what I want to do is talk to you today about some of our experiences that we've had in this area. Senator Wright, you and I last week, we got to attend the Deregathon. And that was led by Governor DeSantis and Halsey Beshears, and they talked about rules and regs and how they increase costs and limit barriers to entry. I would argue that was a good discussion. However, agency rulemaking in some cases and the lack of following Florida law are significantly increasing the cost of Florida's families, and it's nothing but a hidden regulatory tax on the state of Florida. And this is particularly acute in child care. Members, I have 5 key points to share with you today based on our child care providers' experiences with DCF. But before I begin, I want to make one thing very clear. My comments today do not reflect in any way or intended to disparage or discredit an employee at DCF. Their hearts are in the right place. They're doing tough work. They have a hard assignment. And they're willing and frequently will meet with us and talk to us about our concerns. So with that, members, rules are being created without specific authority granted by the legislature. DCF continues to use general rulemaking authority, not specific legislative authority, to justify the implementation of their rules. The requirement of specific authority is to serve as a check and a balance, and to ensure the agency does not regulate beyond the areas granted specifically by the Florida legislature. The agency cannot cite specific rulemaking authority, but rather points only to general rulemaking for the authority for the rules they like or think that how it should be done. In some cases, their stated justification is in direct contribution to Florida or contradiction to Florida law. What's wrong, but what's the recourse to the agency? What penalty do they pay for that? Members, they're adopting rules that are basically moving towards the national standards. DCF is using the rulemaking and to go around, in my opinion, the Florida legislature to raise minimum licensing standards and align with what they're calling national standards. In reality, they're not national standards. It's privately funded research claiming to represent federal health and safety standards for child care. The problem is that even the federal government identifies this research as voluntary, aspirational, and not mandated minimum licensing standards. These regulatory costs are directly contributing to the increased cost for child care in Florida's families. Minimum licensing standards for child care in Florida should only be defined by the Florida legislature in 402-305, and not agency staff or a national standard or someone who thinks they have a good idea in an agency. Members, agencies are creating vague rules. They're using subjective enforcement and different standards by different licensing agents. Rules are being considered that are often written so vaguely that they're difficult to comply with, interpreted different in different areas of the state, and by different DCF licensing agents. That's not the purpose of a rule. The rules are to be specific. They're to be written so they can be interpreted objectively and not subjectively. There needs to be no ambiguity if a child care provider is doing something right or wrong in the state of Florida. Additionally, licensing standards should be interpreted the same regardless of what licensing area agent you have or what area of the state you're in. Members, I want to talk a little bit about what we call the CERC process. A CERC is a statement of estimated regulatory costs. The CERC process needs refinement. It was put in place by the legislature. It's a critical component to rulemaking. It was intended to serve as a check and balance to an agency action. However, it's being gamed. The statement of estimated regulatory costs were put in place with a specific purpose of checking the agency on what cost will this rule cost the private sector. And there were two key components. If the impact of a rule to the private sector is over $200,000, then they needed to complete a CERC. And if that impact equaled $1 million in the aggregate over 5 years, then that rule would need to come back to this body, the legislature, to be ratified. Hey, if you're going to create a rule that's going to impact the private sector, we want to know about it. Maybe we will reconsider that. And that was the check and balance. Members, the agency promulgated a rule on child care that will cost millions to the private sector, but they determined the costs were zero and didn't do a CERC. What were the options for the business community? Hire attorneys, file an administrative rule challenge. This reminds me of a childhood book. My mom taught me to be a lover of reader, and many of you remember the book Fortunately. Fortunately, the flying in a plane. Unfortunately, the plane crashes. Fortunately, I have a parachute. That story. That reminds me of that. Fortunately, we have a CERC process to protect the private sector from out of control rulemaking. Unfortunately, the agency said the rule had zero impact to employers, and they didn't complete a CERC. Fortunately, we could challenge the rule. Unfortunately, we had to spend resources to comply with that rule challenge. Though the rule challenge, now we have a better understanding of what's going on in the agencies, and just frankly, I don't think they have a clue how to calculate the cost for the private sector. It's not what they specialize in, and so I think they struggle with even figuring out that. They don't know how to run the business, and they don't know how to calculate that cost, and I think that's a part of the struggle that they're having. The CERC process is a useless check and balance as an agency cannot or will not accurately calculate the impact of the rule. Members, the CERC law is being gamed. The agency promulgated another rule on child care providers, but this time they completed a CERC. And I want you to remember the basis of the CERC is that if it reaches $1 million in the aggregate over 5 years, then it has to be legislatively ratified. It's not shocking to learn that the CERC was $925,000. Oh, well, okay, that's great. Appreciate that. Members, just to kind of wrap up, my presentation today is not intended to be an attack on DCF. Or a policy discussion on childcare. That's another committee, another day. It's intended to be, frankly, if you take that from my presentation, then I have failed at that. My comments are intended to give you a real-world example of what happens to the agency rulemaking, what happens to a granted rulemaking authority and when that leaves this process, and then why it matters. I attended the last JAPC committee meeting and listened with great interest to your proposal for reforms of the process, and I found a particular interest recommendation 17, which is providing greater authority for JAPC to object to a rule. What is needed most in the rulemaking process is a neutral party, an objective observer with authority, someone who can call balls and strikes. No, you're wrong on this one. You're right on this issue. Or no, the agency is wrong and the agency is right. Without this, the agency can simply ignore the input, ignore the cost of the private sector, and ratify the rule. The only private sector option is to spend money on a rule challenge in court, and that's wrong. Madam Chair, I appreciate the opportunity for your committee and to speak before your committee today, and we'll take any questions if anyone has any.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Madam
Daniel.
Chair.
Any questions? Yes. Representative Polo and then Representative Bashir.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I would like a little bit more information as to the specific rules that we were discussing that DCF did this with. So if offline, you can probably get that to me. I would really appreciate it. I would like to see what the rule was that, because you mentioned they were just kind of making rules that you feel the legislative branch should be responsible for. So I'd just like to see specific examples as to what that is.
Madam,
Yes, Mr. Daniel,
thank
please.
you. I'll be happy to come by your office and spend some time with you. And just by way of an example, the agency, let's see how quickly I can get to it. The agency created a rule in the child care handbook, and we affectionately call it the 1 hour rule. And then basically what the 1 hour rule says is if your parent doesn't bring your child at the designated time to the child care facility, then you must, as a provider, begin to call around and call the parents. And then you can't get the parents, you need to call around and call all the emergency contacts. Okay? And the stated objective of the agency was, well, we have parents that are leaving these children in these cars, and so, we want to play a role in doing that. And our question of the agency was, okay, wait a second, if we haven't taken possession of that child, why are you making it our responsibility in our licensing standards to be responsible for that child? And oh, by the way, if that doesn't happen and we don't call within that 1 hour and that child dies, again, we haven't even taken responsibility for the child, then we're going to be responsible for that and get sued, even though we haven't even taken possession of the child. There is no legislative mandate for that. There was no authority granted for that. That's what they did. That's what they put into place, into law. And so then the legislature, the Florida legislature, came back in and said, no, agency, a child care facility does not take a responsibility for a child when they're being transported to school by a parent. And we went back to the agency, back to DCF and said, you've got to amend your rule. And they said, no, we believe we have the authority to do this, and you're going to continue to do this, regardless of what the legislature says. So that would be one example that I would give, and I have many, and I'll come to your office with that. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Versailles.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Daniel, in your testimony, you indicated that DCF adopted a rule that will cost the industry millions and increase the cost of childcare, but CERC indicated no cost. Can you give an example of that?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the best example of that would be pediatric CPR. Florida statutes, minimum licensing standards in Florida statutes 402, 305, passed by this legislature, says that a private child care facility must have one person on staff at all times that is CPR certified. And that makes sense. And so if that person is me and I go to lunch, I have to have somebody else there to be within the licensing standards. And we find that to be appropriate answer for that. In the rule that we were discussing, and that is a product of that, the agency basically moved that to 100%. So not because the Florida legislature changed minimum licensing standards, but because the agency said in their rule, no, it needs to be a 100% CPR certified everybody. And they had an implementation period for that, and that cost $0. Well, look, I'm not a math student. My dad was a Georgia Tech grad. I am not. But I can tell you that pediatric CPR costs money. When a provider has to pay for their people to take it off-site, it costs money for that, for the indirect cost for that child care provider and the staff to take that. There is money to sort of say that it's a zero cost to providers it's just disingenuous. I guess that would be the best way to answer it. And I guess one more piece to that I think is important to note. When discussing that with the department, we said, hey, look, where's your statutory authority for that? The Florida legislature very clearly spells out in 402, 305. And so they said, oh, well, it's very clear, David. And they pointed me to, in 402, 305, paren 7, sections called sanitation and safety. And it says the minimum standard shall require that at least one staff member trained in CPR as evidenced by current documentation of the course completion must be present at all times. And I said, yeah, okay, it's one. And they said, no, you forgot the word at least. The statute says at least, and you give us general rulemaking authority, and we can raise that to whatever we say that is. At least, now the minimum licensing standard is 100% of staff. So that's just an example. Thank you.
Can you follow up? Okay. Representative Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Daniel, I think you may have actually answered my question sort of in the line of Representative Polo, and just wanting, as you referenced, agency rules that are in conflict with Florida statute. And I think you've just given a couple of examples, but I would ask for the same sort of treatment with Representative Polo. Would love to understand more how current rules are in conflict with both legislative intent and Florida statute.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's a great question. It's the department currently is in rulemaking on a rule, and in their rulemaking justification, they say the department continues to move towards compliance with federal requirements for child care pursuant to Child Care and Development Block Grant, the CCDBG fund, which you're well familiar with, of Act of 2014. Unfortunately, this is in direct contradiction to Florida Statute 102.82, when the Florida legislature reauthorized the block grant funding. They gave OEL as the lead agency, and OEL sets the standards for the school readiness funding, and they did. And the only authority granted to DCF was for inspections of child care providers to monitor compliance and verifying that they've done the safety checklist that was adopted by OEL. So for the department to say, we're creating a rule, and our rule is based on the fact that we're going to move towards compliance with these federal requirements, is disingenuous, and the authority given by the legislature is in contradiction to that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniel.
Thank you.
One more question. Senator Wright.
A question and suggestion, please. Thank you, Mr. Daniels. Very informative. I think you got our attention. And I was going to suggest perhaps, Madam Chair, maybe we try to have a collective meeting rather than Mr. Daniel having to explain it to us one at a time and take our questions. Maybe we could try as a group to find time to meet with you as a group. So just an idea. Thank you.
Yes. Senator